The smell of ionized dust and stale synthetic grease was the only thing that kept Elias Thorne grounded. He was currently shoulder-deep in the primary coolant vein of Sector 7, cursing the ancestors of the person who had decided that copper-nickel alloys were a good idea for a deep space refueling station. Around him, the gloom anchor groaned, a low, rhythmic vibration that felt less like a machine and more like a dying god gasping for its last breath. 34 years old, Elias muttered, his voice echoing inside the metallic shaft. A master's degree in systems architecture from the Lunar Academy, and here I am, playing doctor to a glorified radiator. Fantastic life choices, Thorne. Truly stellar. He yanked his arm back, clutching a severed sensor wire that sparked with a weak, dying blue light. He needed a thermal patch, and he needed it 10 minutes ago. With a sigh that tasted like recycled oxygen, he gathered his kit, a battered box held together by duct tape and stubbornness, and began the long trek back to the engineering hub. The gloom anchor was a labyrinth of obsidian-colored plating and flickering bioluminescent strips. It was a place where light came to die, and the Scythian Syndicate ruled with a ledger instead of a lash. You were either an asset or you were debris. Elias shifted his grip on the heavy bioresonance welder, his boots clattering against the deck plates in a messy, uneven rhythm. He was rounding the corner of Docking Bay 9 when the world suddenly turned into a blur of midnight black and sudden impact. Elias hit something that felt significantly harder than a bulkhead. His toolkit didn't just drop, it exploded. Hydro spanners, microdrivers, and half-empty cans of sealant performed a chaotic zero-gravity dance before clattering across the floor in a cacophony of metallic shrieks. "Watch it, you carbon-based sludge," a voice snarled. It wasn't a human voice. It had a subterranean resonance, a vibration that Elias felt in the marrow of his bones. It sounded like two tectonic plates grinding together, yet it was disturbingly precise. Elias stayed on the floor for a second, staring at a pair of boots. They weren't boots, actually. They were armored talons integrated into obsidian black plating that seemed to drink the meager light of the hallway. He looked up, his gaze traveling past powerful, elongated thighs and a torso wrapped in bioreactive mesh that pulsed with a faint, dangerous violet glow. Standing 7 feet tall, Vexara of the Obsidian Fang looked down at him. She was a ghost walker, one of the elite Valen hunters whose reputation for lethality was the only thing that traveled faster than their warp ships. Her face was a masterclass in predatory elegance, high cheekbones that could cut glass, skin the color of a storm cloud, and eyes that were two burning pools of molten amber. Trailing behind her, held in a shimmering blue containment leash, was something that looked like a nightmare had mated with a tank. It was a Scythian dissident, a multi-limbed creature covered in chitinous plates that clicked together as it writhed. "My tools," Elias said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the fact that his heart was currently trying to bypass his ribcage. "They usually prefer staying in the box. They're shy like that." Vexara's head tilted, a sharp, bird-like movement. Those amber eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "You have obstructed a high-priority transport of the Syndicate, Fragile One. Give me one reason why I should not leave your remains as a decorative smear on this wall." Elias looked at the prisoner, then back at the 7-foot apocalypse standing over him. His brain, usually a fortress of logic, decided that since death was imminent, he might as well enjoy the ride. "Well," Elias started, picking up a hydrospanner and inspecting it with mock seriousness. "For starters, my blood is a nightmare to get out of obsidian plating. Very high iron content. It'll stain. And second, that prisoner of yours looks like he's having a bad hair day. Or a bad leg day. All 12 of them." The hallway went silent. A group of passing cargo droids actually stopped their program routes, their sensors whirring as they calculated the survival probability of the human maintenance man. It was 0. It was definitely 0. Vexara took a step forward. The violet light on her armor flared, syncing with her quickening pulse. She leaned down, her face inches from his. He could smell her, not the scent of a human, but something like ozone after a lightning strike and a hint of crushed winter mint. "You mock a warrior of the 9th Blade?" she whispered, her voice a low growl that made the hair on Elias's arm stand up. "I have extinguished star systems. I have hunted beings that would turn your mind to ash just by looking at them." "Impressive," Elias quipped, his mouth running on pure adrenaline. But do you have a loyalty card? I feel like the 10th genocide should be free. Maybe a nice toaster as a reward. One of Vexara's claws extended, a translucent, needle-sharp blade that shimmered with phase energy. It rested just beneath Elias's chin, cold as the void. He could see the intricate scars on her neck, patterns that glowed softly as she breathed. One day, little engineer, she said, her voice dropping to a predatory purr, you will find yourself beneath my claws when there are no cameras and no syndicate protocols to protect you. And on that day, I will see if your humor tastes as bitter as your fear. Elias grinned, though his knees were trembling. I'll mark my calendar. Should I bring wine? I feel like a murder threat is at least a second date kind of vibe. For a fraction of a millisecond, the predatory mask cracked. Her pupils dilated and the amber glow flickered. It wasn't anger. It was confusion? Surprise? She straightened her back, her armor clicking into a defensive posture. Without another word, she yanked the containment leash, dragging the clicking prisoner behind her as she vanished into the twilight of the docking bay. Elias sat on the floor for a long time, surrounded by his scattered tools. Man, Thorne, a voice breathed from a nearby alcove. It was Jax, one of the older dockers. He was pale, clutching a data slate like a shield. You're either the bravest son of a gun in the galaxy, or you've finally lost the last of your marbles. That was Vexara. She's killed entire mercenary squads for looking at her wrong. Ah! She seemed nice, Elias muttered, his hands finally starting to shake as he gathered his spanners. A bit of a fixer-upper, maybe. Needs to work on her people skills. You're a dead man walking, Jax shook his head, scurrying away. I'm not even going to stand near you. I don't want to be caught in the splash zone when she decides to harvest your organs. Elias didn't answer. He was looking at his hand. There was a tiny microscopic smudge of violet bioluminescent fluid on his knuckle, where he had accidentally brushed against her armor. It felt warm, distractingly warm. He headed back to engineering, but his mind wasn't on coolant leaks anymore. It was on the way her eyes had flickered when he'd mentioned the toaster. For the first time in 3 years, Elias Thorne felt something other than boredom. He felt a target on his back, and somehow, it felt like a reason to wake up tomorrow. 10 hours later, he learned that the universe didn't just have a sense of humor, it had a personal vendetta against him. His communicator buzzed with the high-pitched chime of a Priority 1 summons. Mercer, report to the director's spire. Now, failure to comply will result in immediate contract termination and airlock transit. Director Vargon's office was a cathedral of glass and ego, perched at the very top of the gloom anchor. Vargon himself was a man who looked like he was made of expensive silk and cold calculations. He sat behind a desk of carved asteroid core, staring at Elias with the clinical interest of a biologist looking at a particularly stubborn mold. Thorne, Vargon said, his voice smooth as oil. I've been reviewing the security footage from Bay 9. You had a spirited conversation with our guest Vexara. I was just explaining the benefits of modern kitchen appliances, sir, Elias said, standing at a stiff, awkward attention. Vargon didn't smile. The Valen are a difficult species, Thorne. They are the backbone of our security, but they are increasingly unstable. The Echo Link, their collective consciousness, is experiencing static. Vexara specifically is becoming too individualistic. She filed a formal complaint against you for unprecedented disrespect. So what? Am I being fired? Elias asked, secretly hoping for a one-way ticket to literally anywhere else. On the contrary, Vargon leaned back, a predatory glint in his eyes. You are being promoted. The Valen High Command has requested a cultural liaison to monitor Vexara's integration while she's stationed here. They want someone who isn't afraid of her, someone who can poke the beast, so to speak, to see if she still follows Syndicate directives. Elias felt a cold lump of lead form in his stomach. You want me to be a babysitter ghost walker? Sir, I'm an engineer. I fix pipes. I don't fix 7-foot-tall assassins with anger issues. You'll fix her bioports, Thorne. They're malfunctioning, leaking data and resonance. And as per the Interspecies Cooperation Initiative, you will share quarters with her in Sector 9 for 2 weeks. Elias blinked. Quarters? As in the same air, the same living space, the same place where she keeps her collection of human-sized knives? Precisely, Vargon stood up, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. Report to Habitat C4 at 1900 hours. And Thorne? Try to stay alive. The insurance paperwork for a master systems architect is a real headache. Elias walked out of the office, the word C4 ringing in his ears. It was either his new home or the name of the explosive that was about to blow his life to pieces. Sector 9 was where the gloom anchor tried to pretend it wasn't a rust bucket orbiting a Death Star. The walls were lined with polished synth wood, and the air didn't smell like it had been through 1,000 sets of lungs. Elias stood in front of the door to Habitat C4, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He felt like a condemned man, but instead of a noose, he was facing 2 weeks of shared bathroom time with a woman who could rip a blast door off its hinges. The door hissed open before he could even input his code. The interior was spacious, bathed in a dim, violet-hued light that felt uncomfortably intimate. The main living area was stripped of all furniture, except for a single low-slung couch and a heavy rack mounted on the wall. Elias stopped dead. The rack was filled with blades. Curved scimitars that seemed to hum with internal energy, jagged daggers that looked like they were grown rather than forged, and long, elegant spears made of a pitch-black material that Elias guessed was solidified void matter. You are late, Fragile One. Vexera was standing by the panoramic viewport, her back to him. She had discarded her heavy outer plating, wearing only a skin-tight tactical bodysuit that left her muscular arms and the back of her neck exposed. In the low light, her bioports were mesmerizing, 6 metallic circles embedded along her spine, glowing with a restless, flickering amber light. I had to say goodbye to my houseplants, Elias said, stepping into the room and dropping his bag. I told them if I wasn't back in 2 weeks, they should start a rebellion. Vexera turned around. Without the armor, she looked less like a machine and more like a person, albeit a very large, very dangerous person. Her skin held a faint shimmer, a fine layer of scales that caught the light like crushed velvet. Your humor is a defect, she said, walking toward him with a grace that made no sound. In my culture, those who cannot speak with honor are silenced, permanently. Lucky for me, we're on a Syndicate station, Elias said, leaning against his bag. Here, we're allowed to be as annoying as we want, as long as the quotas are met. Speaking of quotas, I'm here to check your ports. Vargon says you're leaking resonance. Vexera's expression darkened. The amber glow in her eyes flared into a deep, angry orange. The director is a scavenger who picks at the wounds of warriors. My ports are mine. Look, Vex. Can I call you Vex? No? Okay. Look, Vexera. I don't want to be here any more than you do. But if your resonance keeps spiking, you're going to set off the station's EM alarms, and then security will come in here with stun prods and heavy restraints. I'm the path of least resistance. Let me do my job, and I'll stay in my room and pretend you don't exist for the rest of the night. She hovered on the edge of his personal space, her height forcing him to look up at a sharp angle. He could feel the heat radiating from her, a biological furnace. Through the bioneural link that was part of the station's liaison protocol, a faint ripple of emotion bled into his mind. It wasn't anger, it was cold, a deep, hollow sense of isolation. Fine, she spat, turning her back to him. Do what you must, engineer, but if your hands tremble, I will consider it an insult. I've worked on fusion cores while they were melting down, Vexera. I think I can handle a few bioports. He reached into his kit and pulled out a diagnostic scanner. Sit on the couch. I need a stable angle. She complied, though her posture remained as rigid as a statue. Elias moved behind her, his heart rate finally settling into a professional rhythm. As he brought the scanner close to her neck, he saw the true complexity of Valen engineering. The ports weren't just metal, they were woven into her nerves, small filaments of fiber optics disappearing into her gray-blue skin. The resonance is high, Elias murmured, looking at the data slate. Your echo link is trying to sync with a hive mind that isn't here. It's creating a feedback loop. Does it hurt? Vexera remained silent for a long moment. It is loud, she finally whispered, like 1,000 voices screaming in a room with no doors. The Syndicate's technology tries to suppress it, but it only makes the echo angry. Elias felt a sudden, unexpected pang of empathy. He knew what it was like to have a mind full of noise you couldn't turn off. He reached out, his fingers hovering just an inch from the uppermost port. "I'm going to apply a localized dampening field," he said softly. "It'll feel like ice water for a second, but then the noise should quiet down." "Do it," she commanded. As the dampening pulse left the tool, Vexara gasped. Her entire body arched, her hands gripping the edges of the synthetic cushions until the material hissed and tore under her claws. Elias instinctively reached out with his free hand, resting it on her shoulder to steady her. The contact was like a lightning strike. Through the bioports, the connection flared. For one heartbeat, Elias wasn't in a room on Gloom Anchor. He was standing in a vast, infinite forest of silver trees, hearing the thoughts of millions of Valen, a crushing weight of collective memory and duty. And then he felt Vexara's specific voice, a sharp, lonely note of defiance in that overwhelming choir. She snapped her head around, grabbing his wrist with a grip that could have crushed a steel pipe. Her eyes were wide, the amber pool swimming with tears she refused to let fall. You saw it," she breathed. Elias swallowed hard, his breath hitching. "It's a bit crowded in there, isn't it?" She didn't let go of his wrist, but the pressure softened. Her claws retracted, leaving only the warmth of her palms against his skin. She looked at him, really looked at him, without the mask of the ninth blade. "Why are you not afraid?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Humans are fragile. I could break you with a thought. My echo could drown your soul." Elias managed a small, tired smile. "I've spent the last 5 years being afraid of my own shadow, Vexara. After a while, you just get bored of being scared. Besides, you're not the echo. You're just a girl who needs her ports tuned." She stared at him for a long beat, then slowly released his hand. She turned back around, her shoulders slumping just a fraction. "The noise," she whispered. "It is quieter now. Thank you, Elias Thorne." "Don't mention it," he said, packing his tools. "Literally. Don't tell anyone I was being nice. I have a reputation for being a grumpy hermit to uphold." "Your secret is safe," she said, her voice regaining some of its lethal edge, though the violet glow of her armor was now a steady, peaceful pulse. Elias stood up, heading toward the small secondary bedroom. "Good night, Vexara. Try not to sharpen your spears too loudly. I'm a light sleeper." He closed his door and leaned against it, his heart racing for an entirely different reason now. He looked at his hand, the one that had touched her shoulder. The violet stain was gone, but the warmth remained. 2 weeks. It was going to be a very long 2 weeks. As he drifted off to sleep, Elias heard a sound through the thin partition. It was a low, vibrating hum. At first he thought it was the tram's life support system, but then he realized the rhythm was different. It was organic. It was steady. Vexara was purring. The deadliest warrior in the sector was curled up in the next room, finally finding a moment of peace in the silence Elias had given her. He smiled in the dark, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, the architect of systems slept without dreaming of his failures. The lower levels of Gloom Anchor were known colloquially as the gut, and for good reason. If the upper spires were the station's ego, gleaming with diplomatic suites and executive lounges, the gut was its raw, pulsating ID. It was a cavernous wasteland of thrumming pipes, screaming steam vents, and gravitational anomalies that could turn your stomach inside out if you didn't keep your mag boots locked to the deck. Elias Thorne stood on a narrow catwalk, suspended over a 300-foot drop into the primary waste reclamation vortex. He was currently fighting a losing battle with a high-pressure plasma conduit that was behaving more like an angry serpent than a piece of industrial hardware. "Hold the stabilizer, Vex. If this thing slips, we're both going to be reduced to a collection of very warm atoms," Elias shouted over the deafening roar of venting gases. Standing behind him, Vexara didn't flinch. She had traded her ceremonial blades for a heavy-duty industrial tether, her 7-foot frame anchored to a reinforced support pillar. Even without her full combat plating, she looked like a goddess of the forge, her gray-blue skin glistening with a fine sheen of sweat that caught the flickering amber light of the emergency strobes. "Your technology is petulant, Elias Thorne," she rumbled, her voice cutting through the mechanical din with ease. "It groans like a wounded beast because it was designed by those who fear the void rather than those who embrace it." "Yeah, well, The petulant technology is currently the only thing keeping the air in our lungs from becoming vacuum flavor, Elias grunted. He jammed a micro-welder into the conduit seam, the tool screaming as it fought to knit the superheated metal back together. I need more torque! Give it a yank! Vexara pulled. With a strength that would have shattered a human's vertebrae, she hauled the tether taut. The conduit groaned, its violent thrashing subsiding into a low, menacing hum. Elias worked with frantic precision, his fingers dancing across the control panel. He was in his element here, amidst the chaos and the grease. This was the one place where the noise in his head, the echoes of his past failures, was drowned out by the noise of the machines. Got it, he gasped, slamming the locking pin into place. Conduit stabilized. Telemetry is back in the green. We're 5 by 5, Vex. He wiped a smear of grime from his forehead, leaning back against the cold obsidian railing. His heart was still hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked up at Vexara, who was staring down at the glowing conduit with an expression of clinical detachment. You speak of 5 by 5, she said, her amber eyes shifting to meet his. Is this more of your human linguistic static? It means we're good, safe, operational, Elias explained with a tired grin. It's old military slang. My grandfather used it. It's about clarity, signal strength, and volume. If they're both at a 5, you can hear the truth through the noise. Vexara loosened the tether, her movements fluid and predatory. The truth is often the loudest thing in the room, yet your species spends a lifetime trying to build walls against it. She stepped closer to him on the narrow catwalk. In the cramped space, Elias was acutely aware of her size, the sheer physical presence she commanded. But he didn't feel the paralyzing terror he'd felt 3 days ago in Docking Bay 9. Instead, there was a strange, budding sense of camaraderie, a professional respect born from surviving a suicide shift together. Check your ports, Vex, Elias said, his tone softening. The resonance from that welder was pretty heavy. I saw your spine flaring violet back there. Vexara stiffened, her hand instinctively going to the back of her neck. I am functional. The echo is manageable. Don't lie to the guy who literally has to sign off on your maintenance logs, Elias countered. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small handheld sensor. You saved my life 10 minutes ago when that valve blew. Let me return the favor. Sit rep, Vex. How bad is the noise? Through the liaison link, Elias felt a sharp jab of irritation, followed quickly by a wave of exhaustion. Vexara sighed, a sound that was surprisingly human, and lowered her head. The feedback is constant, she admitted, her voice dropping to a low whisper. Since the collision, the Syndicate's dampeners have been ghosting on me. The echo link feels like it's trying to drag me back into the forest, but the path is full of broken glass. Let's take a look. Elias moved behind her, his boots clanking softly on the grating. He brought the sensor to her uppermost port. The reading was foobar. The frequency wasn't just drifting. It was jagged, a sawtooth wave of bioelectric energy that was literal agony to any nervous system. God, Vexara, how are you even standing? This port is overclocking by at least 40%. You're ghosting your own synapses. I am Vexara of the Ninth Blade, she said, though her shoulders trembled slightly. I do not yield to pain. Yeah, well, the Ninth Blade is about to have a catastrophic system failure, Elias muttered. He adjusted the setting on his resonance welder to a low-frequency pulse. This is going to be intimate, Vex. I have to interface my tool directly with your neural filaments to flush the static. You need to trust me. He felt her heart rate spike through the link. It was a primal fear, the fear of a predator being vulnerable. If you fail, Elias Thorne, if you scramble my mind, then I'll be the one doing the decorative smear on the wall, remember? Elias tried to keep his voice light, but his hands were steady as stones. I'm an architect of systems. You're just the most complicated system I've ever had to debug. Now hold still. Focus on my voice. Ignore the echo. He pressed the tip of the tool against the metallic ring at the base of her skull. Vexara let out a sharp, keening cry, a sound of pure Valen distress, and her claws dug into the catwalk's railing, bending the reinforced steel like it was tinfoil. Easy, easy, Elias whispered, stepping into her personal space and resting his free hand on the small of her back. The heat coming off her skin was intense, nearly blistering through his gloves. I'm here. Just me. No echo. No syndicate. Just the gut. As the resonance welder began its work, the violet glow in her ports started to settle, shifting from a frantic flicker to a deep, steady pulse. Elias could feel the static clearing in his own mind, the overwhelming weight of the Valen hive mind receding like a tide. In its place, there was a sudden, jarring clarity. He saw a flash of a memory, not his own, a silver forest under a violet sky. A young Valen, her scales still soft, standing before a circle of elders. They were trying to link her, to weave her soul into the great tapestry of the echo, but she was fighting them. She wanted to hear the wind. She wanted to be a singular note, not a chord. The memory snapped, leaving Elias breathless. Vexara slumped forward, her head resting against his chest. She was gasping for air, her entire body vibrating with the aftershocks of the neural flush. You saw the forest, she breathed, her voice muffled by his flight suit. I saw a girl who didn't want to join the club, Elias said softly. He didn't pull away. He stood there on the catwalk, 300 feet above a waste vortex, holding the deadliest woman in the galaxy while she reassembled her soul. They call it a defect, Vixara whispered. The echo link is supposed to be our grace, our unity. But for me, it has always been a prison. The Syndicate, they promised to fix me, to give me silence. But all they did was turn the prison into a cage of wires. Elias looked down at her, seeing the intricate patterns of her ports and the subtle scars of her conditioning. He thought of his own life, the ways he had tried to bury his identity and work, the way he had fled the Lunar Academy after the disaster at the Mary Nubium colony. He had spent years trying to be a cog in a machine, just like the Syndicate wanted her to be a weapon in their hand. We're a pair of broken circuits, aren't we, Vex? She pulled back slowly, her amber eyes searching his face. The orange glow had faded, replaced by a soft, luminous gold. You are a strange meat sack, Elias Thorne, she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Your humor is atrocious. Your body is fragile. And yet, you have a signal that is 5 by 5. Best compliment I've had all year, Elias said, packing his kit. Come on, the shift is over. If we stay down here any longer, the air recyclers are going to start tasting like recycled boots. As they walked back toward the elevators, Vexera stayed close to him. Not the rigid tactical distance she usually maintained, but a proximity that felt intentional. Elias? Yeah? The pizza. You said it was the greatest food in the galaxy. I stand by that statement. It's a hill I'm willing to die on. I wish to test this theory. When we return to Habitat C4, Elias smiled, a genuine, warm feeling spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with bioneural links. Consider it done, Vexara. But fair warning, once you go pepperoni, you never go back. The lift climbed upward, leaving the darkness of the gut behind. But as the doors hissed shut, Elias caught a glimpse of a security camera mounted in the corner of the shaft. Its red sensor eye followed them with a cold, mechanical hunger. The Syndicate was watching. And in a world where you were either an asset or debris, being two broken circuits starting to knit together was the most dangerous malfunction of all. Habitat C4 smelled like the Centauri whiskey Elias had finally decided to open. The amber liquid swirled in a pair of mismatched glass tumblers, one a souvenir from a defunct Martian casino, the other a utilitarian cylinder from the station's mess hall. Elias stood in the small kitchenette, his brow furrowed in concentration as he operated the food fabricator. He had spent the last hour overriding the device's nutritional safety protocols to ensure the pizza it produced had the correct ratio of grease to structural integrity. You are performing a ritual, Vexara observed from the couch. She was sitting cross-legged, her long limbs draped over the cushions with a grace that made the furniture look clumsy. She was wearing one of Elias's oversized engineering hoodies, a garment that looked like a cape on her, the sleeves pushed up to reveal the bioports on her forearms. It's not a ritual, it's chemistry, Elias argued, sliding a steaming disk of dough and cheese onto a ceramic plate. Fabricators are great for nutrient paste and synthetic proteins, but they have no soul. You have to massage the algorithms if you want actual flavor. He walked over and set the plate on the low table between them, The scent of melted cheese and spicy synthesized pepperoni filled the room, competing with the ozone and mint tang of Vexera's skin. "Behold," Elias said, gesturing with his tumbler, "the ninth wonder of the world, or at least the ninth wonder of Sector 9. Vexera leaned forward, her nostrils flaring. She picked up a slice with her armored talons, her movements precise. She studied the way the cheese stretched, a look of profound suspicion on her face. "It is structurally unsound," she noted. "That's the point. It's a controlled collapse of deliciousness. Just eat it, Vex." She took a cautious bite. For a moment she went perfectly still, her amber eyes widening until the pupils were nearly invisible. Her bioports pulsed a rapid, rhythmic gold, a sign of sensory overload. "The flavor," she whispered, taking a larger bite. "It is aggressive. It attacks the palate with heat and fat. Why would your people invent something that is so inefficient?" "Because efficiency is boring, Vexara," Elias said, sitting on the floor across from her. "Humans spend our whole lives knowing we're going to break eventually. We're soft. We're short-lived. So we invent things that make the breaking part feel like it was worth it. Pizza, whiskey, terrible movies. They're all ways of saying I'm here and I'm enjoying the view before the lights go out." "Hawker," Vexara finished the slice and reached for another, her movements losing some of their habitual rigidity. "My people do not seek to enjoy the view. We seek to be the view. The Valen aim for a geometry of perfection. The echo is the perfect shape, a sphere of collective memory where no thought is wasted and no voice is alone." "But you're alone," Elias pointed out, his voice gentle. "You're out here, hunting war criminals for the Syndicate, while your echo is thousands of light years away. Doesn't that make you imperfect?" Vexera stared into her whiskey, the reflection of the station's neon lights dancing in the amber liquid. "The elders say I am a splinter, a shard that didn't fit the mold. They sent me to the Syndicate because the Syndicate knows how to use broken things. They installed the dampeners to quiet my defect, my desire to be a singular note." She looked up at Elias, and for the first time, he saw the depth of the loneliness she carried. It wasn't just isolation, it was the grief of a person who had been told her very existence was an error. "Is that why you're here, Elias Thorne? Are you also a splinter?" Elias took a long pull of his drink, the burn of the whiskey a welcome distraction from the weight of her gaze. "I wasn't a splinter, I was a cornerstone, or I thought I was. I was the lead systems architect for the Mare Nubium colony. 5,000 people living under a dome I designed. I thought the geometry was perfect, Vex. I thought I'd accounted for every variable. What happened? A micrometeorite shower, 1 in a million trajectory. It hit the primary oxygen scrubber's cooling line, the same kind of pipe we fixed today. I'd used a cheaper alloy to stay under budget. I told myself it was within the safety margins. I told myself the Syndicate would be happy with the savings." He stared at his hands, the grease-stained fingers that were so good at fixing things but had failed to protect the things that mattered. The lines shattered. The scrubbers failed. The backup systems had a software lag I hadn't patched because I was too busy optimizing the executive lounges. 200 people didn't make it to the shelters in time. The silence in Habitat C4 was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air recyclers. Elias waited for the judgment. He waited for Vexara to call him weak, or a failure, or a fragile one who deserved his exile. Instead, he felt a warmth on his hand. Vexara had reached out, her long clawed fingers resting over his. Her touch was surprisingly light, her skin feeling like warm, smooth stone. "You built a sphere," she said softly, "and when it broke, you saw the shards and blamed yourself for not being a god. My people would say you lack honor, but your species, you have something else. You have the capacity to carry the weight of those who are gone without letting it crush the living." She squeezed his hand, her talons retracted. "You are not a cornerstone, Elias. You are a bridge. You fix the things that are broken so that others do not have to fall." Elias looked up, his eyes stinging. "I'm just a guy with a hydro spanner, Vex." "And I am just a girl who needs her ports tuned," she countered, echoing his words from the previous night. She stood up, pulling him to his feet. The mood shifted, the heaviness dissolving into something more intimate, more electric. They stood in the center of the room, the violet twilight of the station casting long, intersecting shadows across the floor. "Teach me more, Elias Thorne," she whispered, her face inches from his. "Teach me about the things that aren't efficient. Teach me why your species fights so hard to be singular notes in a universe that wants a choir." Elias didn't answer with words. He reached up, his fingers tracing the scarification patterns on her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. Through the link, he felt her purr, a deep, resonant vibration that started in her chest and echoed in his soul. It wasn't a biological reflex, it was a choice. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a collision of two different worlds, the salt of human skin against the ozone of Valen biology. It was messy, it was unsound, and it violated every protocol of the Interspecies Cooperation Initiative. It was 5 by 5. They spent the next few hours on the low couch, tangled in a mess of hoodies and blankets. Vexara talked about the silver forest, and Elias talked about the red dust of Mars. They laughed at the absurdity of their situation, an exiled architect and a malfunctioning assassin hiding from the galaxy in a room that smelled like pizza. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them. Elias lay back, his head resting on the cushions. Vexara curled up beside him, her massive frame fitting against him with surprising ease. She rested her head on his chest, her weight a comforting pressure. "Kai," she murmured, using the nickname she had heard from the other maintenance techs. "Yeah, Vex. I think I understand why you keep the old circuit boards." "Oh yeah, why's that?" "Because even if they no longer function, they hold the memory of the current that once flowed through them. They are not obsolete. They are stories." "Exactly," Elias whispered, ruffling her silver hair. "Everything is a story, Vex. We're just the ones currently being written." She purred again, the sound vibrating through Elias's ribs, lulling him into a deep, dreamless sleep. For the first time in years, the architect wasn't worried about the safety margins. He wasn't worried about the Syndicate or the Echo or the target on his back. He was home. But outside the panoramic window, the gloom anchor continued its cold, indifferent rotation. In the security hubs of Sector 1, analysts were already reviewing the logs. The neural flush Elias had performed in the gut hadn't gone unnoticed. The dampening of Vexara's Echo Link had triggered a silent alarm in the Valen High Command. To the Syndicate, a bridge was a useful tool, but a bridge that connected two broken splinters into something whole was a threat to the architecture of their power. As the two of them slept, a squad of recalibration specialists, ghost walkers whose echo links were so strong they had no names, only designations, began their descent into Sector 9. The 2-week initiative was only on day 4, and the price of a singular note was about to go up. The silence of day 5 in Habitat C4 was shattered not by an alarm, but by the absence of a sound Elias had grown to rely on. He woke up on the narrow cot in the guest room, his ears straining for the low-frequency vibration of Vexara's purr. It was usually a constant, comforting rhythm that permeated the synthwood walls, a biological hum that told him the deadliest woman in the galaxy was at peace. But this morning, the air was dead. Elias sat up, his 34-year-old joints popping like dry kindling. He reached for his data slate, checking the local time. It was 0400 hours. Vexara should have been in the middle of her morning conditioning, the rhythmic thud of her armored feet against the deck plates serving as his alarm clock. He slid out of bed, his feet hitting the cold floor. He didn't bother with boots, moving in his socks toward the living area. The violet twilight of the station's night cycle still bathed the room in long, jagged shadows. "Vex?" he whispered, his voice sounding thin and fragile in the stillness. There was no answer. He pushed open the door to her room. It was empty. The rack on the wall was bare. Every one of her blades was gone. The oversized hoodie he'd lent her was folded neatly on the edge of the cot, a stark gray contrast to the obsidian surroundings. A spike of cold adrenaline hit his gut. Through the bioneural link, he felt nothing. The connection that had been a warm thread in the back of his mind for the last 96 hours had gone flat, replaced by a wall of static so dense it made his vision blur. "Glitched," Elias muttered, rubbing his neck. "The port tuning must have drifted." He turned to head back to the kitchenette to grab his toolkit when the front door hissed open. It wasn't the smooth pneumatic sigh of a standard entry. It was an override, a violent, forced decompression of the magnetic locks that sent a cloud of frost swirling into the room. Three figures stepped through the mist. They were Valen, but they were wrong. They stood 7 feet tall, wrapped in the same midnight plating as Vexara, but their armor lacked the individuality of her scarification patterns. It was smooth, sterile, and pulsed with a synchronized, sickly white light. Their faces were hidden behind featureless visors of polished bone glass. Elias froze. His master's degree in systems architecture hadn't prepared him for a standoff with three hive-minded killing machines in his living room. "Elias Thorne," the lead figure said. The voice wasn't a growl or a purr. It was a chorus. Three voices speaking in a perfect, terrifying unison that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in his skull. "Maintenance designation. Architect. You have interfered with the integrity of Shard 412. "Shard 412? Elias asked, his mouth dry. He started backing toward the kitchenette, his fingers reaching for the edge of the counter where he'd left a heavy-duty plasma torch. "I think you've got the wrong habitat, Chooms. I only know a girl named Vexara, and she's definitely not a shard of anything." "Individual names are a symptom of the static," the chorus responded, their movements perfectly synchronized as they fanned out to hem him in. "Vexara is a malfunctioning unit. You have dampened her connection to the Echo Link. You have encouraged the splintering of her purpose." "I fixed her ports," Elias snapped, his fear giving way to a sharp, defensive anger. "She was in pain. The Syndicate's tech was overclocking her nerves. I gave her silence." "Is that a crime in the Silver Forest?" The lead specialist tilted its head, the same bird-like movement Vexara used, but devoid of any soul. "The forest is the echo. The echo is the law. Silence is the precursor to the void. You have stolen a weapon of the Ninth Blade and attempted to turn it into a person. This is an act of biological sabotage against the Valen High Command." One of the specialists raised a hand. A series of metallic filaments extended from its palm, glowing with the same white light as their armor. "We are here for recalibration. Shard 412 has been retrieved. You will now submit to a memory scrub to ensure Syndicate secrets remain internal." "Wait, you said you retrieved her? Where is she?" Elias's heart felt like it was being squeezed by a hydraulic press. "If you've heard her, I swear to God." "The fragile one makes threats," the chorus mocked. "You are an architect of pipes and wires. You are nothing to the Echo." The filaments lashed out, moving faster than Elias could blink. He dived to the left, his shoulder slamming into the food fabricator as the white-hot wires hissed through the air where his head had been a second ago. He grabbed the plasma torch, thumbing the ignition. A 2-foot blade of blue fire roared to life, lighting up the room in a hellish glare. "I'm an architect of systems," Elias roared, swinging the torch in a wide arc to keep them back. "And right now, you're the biggest bug I've ever seen in the code." "Resistance is a secondary symptom of the static," the specialist chanted. They didn't seem bothered by the fire. They moved like shadows, circling him with a predatory grace that made Vexara's combat forms look like a dance. Elias dived behind the low couch, his mind racing. He was zeroed. He was absolutely zeroed if he tried to fight them. But he was an engineer. He knew the layout of Habitat C4 better than the people who built it. He knew that the flooring wasn't solid obsidian. It was a layered composite designed to hide the primary power conduits for Sector 9. He jammed the plasma torch into the floor plates beneath the couch. "Thorne, what are you doing?" The voice came from his communicator, a frantic shout from Marcus back in engineering. "The power grid in Sector 9 just spiked to 12,000%. The whole deck is about to—" "I'm debugging, Marcus! Shut up and hold the line!" The floor plates buckled, the metal liquefying under the intense heat. Below the deck, the thick, violet-sheathed cables of the station's main power vein hummed with enough electricity to vaporize a small moon. Elias grabbed the heavy synthwood table and flipped it over, using it as a makeshift shield. "Hey, Shards, you want to talk about unity? Let's talk about grounding." He plunged a hydrospanner into the exposed power vein. The explosion was a blinding flash of violet lightning. The habitat's internal dampeners screamed as the surge overloaded the room's systems. The three specialists were tossed backward, their white armor flickering and hissing as the massive electrical discharge fought their internal shields. Elias didn't wait to see if they were dead. He scrambled toward the maintenance hatch hidden behind the weapon rack. He yanked the lever, the heavy obsidian door sliding open to reveal a dark, cramped shaft that led into the station's vanes. He dived in, the door slamming shut behind him just as the white light of the specialists began to pulse again in the room above. The shaft was barely 3 feet wide, a vertical drop into the darkness of the station's infrastructure. Elias locked his mag boots and began a controlled slide, his hands burning as he gripped the guide rails. He fell for what felt like 5 kilometers, the wind whistling past his ears, until he hit a horizontal junction with a bone-jarring thud. He lay there for a second, gasping for air. His shoulder was definitely dislocated, and his ribs felt like they'd been through a trash compactor. But he was alive. "Vex," he whispered, his hand going to his neck. "Talk to me, Vex. Where are you?" The static in his mind shifted. It didn't clear, but a single image punched through. A cold, sterile laboratory. Vexara was strapped to a metallic chair, her bioports connected to a series of thick, translucent tubes that were pumping a white, milky fluid into her spine. Her amber eyes were wide, the pupils blown out, her face a mask of silent agony. Beside her stood Director Vargan. He was talking to a Valen elder, a creature whose scales had turned a dull, matte gray with age. "The wipe protocol is 60% complete," Vargan's voice echoed through the link, distorted and metallic. "By morning, the 9th blade will be a perfect, obedient tool once more." The human liaison provided excellent data on her emotional vulnerabilities. His disrespect was the perfect catalyst to expose the cracks in her conditioning. Elias felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with his injuries. It was a setup. The entire 2-week initiative, the shared quarters, the port tuning, it was all an experiment. The Syndicate didn't want peace. They wanted to know how to break a Ghostwalker's spirit so they could rebuild it as a programmable slave. And he had been the one to hold the spanner. He had been the one to open the door for them. "I'm coming, Vex," Elias gritted out, forcing himself to stand. He looked at his hands. The fingers that had built the Mare Nubium colony, the fingers that had stayed at the budget while people died, the fingers that had just accidentally helped a corporation lobotomize the only person who had made him feel human in 5 years. "Not this time," he vowed, his voice echoing in the dark tunnels of the gut. "I'm not looking at the budget this time." He pulled his toolkit from his belt, the battered gray box still miraculously attached. He didn't have a weapon, and he didn't have an army. But he was an architect. He knew the station's heartbeat. And if the Syndicate wanted to use his skills to break a person, he was going to use those same skills to break their world. The veins of Gloom Anchor were a nightmare of overlapping systems and forgotten architecture. It was a place where gravity was a suggestion, and the temperature fluctuated between the freezing void and the blistering heat of the fusion reactors. For 2 hours, Elias moved through the shadows, a ghost in the machine. His dislocated shoulder was a screaming agony, but he'd used a piece of thermal tape to bind his arm to his chest, creating a makeshift sling. He was currently crawling through a ventilation duct that overlooked the primary security hub of Sector 1, the eye of the Syndicate. Through the grating, he could see the laboratory. It was exactly as it had appeared in the vision. Vixara was still in the chair. The white fluid in the tubes was pulsing now, synchronized with the rhythmic chanting of the gray-scaled Valen elder standing over her. Vargan was there too, sipping a glass of expensive-looking green liquid while he watched the monitors. "Resonance levels are stabilizing," a technician reported. "Individual personality markers are dropping. Shard 412 is returning to the echo." Elias's grip tightened on the edge of the grating. He could feel her through the link. The Vexara he knew was being drowned in a sea of white noise. The forest was closing in, the silver trees turning into bars of a cage. She wasn't purring anymore. She wasn't even screaming. She was fading into a singular, obedient note. "Okay, Thorne." "Think," Elias whispered to himself. "You can't outfight them. You can't outshoot them. So you have to outsystem them." He looked at the laboratory's layout. It was a pressurized environment, isolated from the rest of the station to prevent biocontamination during the White Protocol. It had its own independent life support, its own power backup, and its own atmospheric scrubbers. And it was all connected to the central coolant line he'd been fixing for the last 3 years. Elias pulled out his data slate and began to type. His fingers moved with a fluid, desperate speed, bypassing encryption layers that would have taken a standard hacker days to crack. But he wasn't a hacker. He was the one who had written the original kernel for the station's environmental controls. "Enter the back door," he murmured. "Username, architect. Password, 5 by 5. The screen flickered, and suddenly the station's entire internal map unfolded before him. He could see every valve, every sensor, every gram of oxygen moving through the gloom anchor. He didn't target the power. Vargan would have a triple redundant backup for that. He didn't target the doors. The specialists would just cut through them. He targeted the gravity. "Marcus," Elias whispered into his comms, "I need you to pull the emergency brake on the Deck 12 stabilizers. Now." "Thorne, are you crazy? If I pull that, the whole deck will experience a 3G lateral shift. People will be throwing up for a week." "Just do it, Marcus, and tell the engineering boys to lock their boots. We're about to have a very bad day." "Copy that, Choom. God help us." Pulling the pin in 3, 2, 1. The station didn't just shake, it lurched. A deafening groan of tortured metal echoed through the ducts as the massive stabilizers on Deck 12 stalled. For the inhabitants of Sector 1, the world suddenly tilted 45 degrees to the right. Through the grating, Elias watched as Vargan was thrown across the room, his green drink painting a long neon streak across the obsidian wall. The Valen specialists, despite their superior reflexes, stumbled as their internal gyros fought to compensate for the sudden, violent shift in momentum. The medical tubes connected to Vexara's spine hissed and buckled. The white fluid began to leak, splashing onto the floor in a viscous puddle. Elias didn't waste a second. He kicked the grating open and dived into the room, his mag boots catching the floor plates just as the station began to right itself. He landed in a roll, his one good hand reaching for the primary console. "Thorne!" Vargan snarled, struggling to his feet. He reached for a sidearm, his face a mask of aristocratic fury. "You pathetic, disobedient meat sack. You've just signed your death warrant." "The paperwork is already filed, Vargan," Elias shouted, his fingers slamming into the override key on the console. Instead of shutting down the lab, Elias did something far more dangerous. He activated the bioresonance welder's frequency through the room's internal speakers. A wall of sound, a jagged, chaotic pulse of discordant energy, exploded into the room. It was the static he had used to flush Vexara's ports, amplified by a factor of 1,000. For a human, it was just a deafening, unpleasant noise. But for a Valen, it was a psychic frag grenade. The specialists screamed, their featureless bone glass visors cracking as their echo links were shattered by the overwhelming noise. They collapsed to their knees, their hands clutching their heads as the unity they relied on was torn apart by a single defiant human frequency. Elias ignored them, scrambling toward the chair. "Vex! Vex, wake up!" He grabbed a heavy blade from the floor, one of Vexara's own daggers that had been tossed aside like a piece of garbage. With a desperate grunt, he hacked through the translucent tubes, the milky fluid spraying over his flight suit. Vexara's eyes snapped open. The pupils were still dilated, but the amber was back, burning with a frantic, terrified intensity. She looked at Elias, her mouth opening in a silent cry. "I've got you," Elias whispered, yanking the restraints free. "We're bugging out, Vex, now!" He pulled her from the chair. She was weak, her limbs moving with a sluggish, uncoordinated effort. But the moment her hand touched his, the link flared back to life. It wasn't static anymore. It was a roar of gratitude and fury. "Fragile one," she gasped, her claws digging into his good shoulder. "Yeah, that's me. The guy with the atrocious humor," Elias said, hauling her toward the maintenance hatch he'd entered through. "Stop them!" Vargan shrieked, cowering behind a reinforced desk. "Kill them both! I don't care about the asset anymore. Just end it!" One of the specialists, its armor blackened and its white light fading, managed to stand. It raised a pulse rifle, its movements jerky and robotic. Elias saw the muzzle flare. He didn't have a shield. He didn't have armor. He was just a man in a grease-stained flight suit. But he didn't move. He stood in front of Vexara, his broken shoulder braced against her chest, his body a shield for a woman who had once threatened to smear him across a wall. The pulse bolt hit. It didn't hit Elias. A blur of midnight black and silver light intercepted the shot. Vexara had lunged forward, her long dormant reflexes ignited by the sight of Elias in danger. She caught the bolt on her armored forearm, the energy dissipating in a shower of violet sparks. She didn't use a blade. She didn't need one. She reached the specialist in 2 strides, her talons burying themselves in its bone-glass visor. With a twist of her torso, she ripped the helmet clean off, revealing a face that was a hollow, empty shell of a Valen. She tossed the body aside like it was a broken toy. The other 2 specialists tried to engage, but Vexara was a singular note now, a scream of pure, unfiltered individuality. She moved through them like a storm, her movements no longer synchronized with anything but her own will. Within 15 seconds, the laboratory was a graveyard of obsidian plating and white bioluminescence. She turned to Vargan, who was currently trying to climb into an emergency escape pod. "No!" Vexara rumbled, her voice a deep, vibrating chord that made the glass walls rattle. "The director stays to witness the view." She slammed her fist into the pod's control panel, welding the door shut with a burst of bioelectric energy. "Vex!" Elias gasped, leaning against the chair for support. His chest was burning, his vision narrowing. The station's lurch had done more damage than he'd realized. "We need to go. Security is on the way. Deck 12, lateral shift, only buys us 5 minutes." Vexara was at his side in an instant. She didn't look like a warrior now. She looked like a person terrified of losing the only thing that mattered. She scooped him up in her arms, her strength returning with a vengeful intensity. "You are not dying, Elias Thorne," she whispered, her amber eyes swimming with liquid starlight. "I do not permit it. You have to show me the forest. The real one. It's, a bit of a walk from here." Elias managed a weak grin before the darkness finally claimed him. As Vexara dived back into the maintenance tunnels, carrying the architect of her freedom, the gloom anchor began to wail. Not the rhythmic groan of a machine, but the chaotic, panicked scream of a system that had lost its control. The turning point had passed. The asset was gone. The bridge was built. And for the first time in 5 years, the price of a singular note was a cost Elias Thorne was proud to pay. But as they vanished into the gut, a new signal began to pulse from the Valen High Command. Not a recalibration specialist this time. Something older. Something that didn't use white light. The hunt of the first blade had begun. And in the vast cold void of space, there was nowhere left to hide from the echo. The darkness inside the maintenance arteries of Gloom Anchor was not absolute. It was a bruised, sickly purple, illuminated by the rhythmic thumping of Vexara's bioports. Elias Thorne was only half conscious, his world reduced to the sensation of being carried and the metallic tang of blood pooling at the back of his throat. Every time Vexara took a stride, the vibration rattled his broken ribs, sending white-hot sparks of agony behind his eyelids. "Hang in there, architect," Vexara's voice rumbled. It was no longer the cold, tectonic grind of the ninth blade. It was strained, flickering with a very human-sounding desperation. "Do not let the signal fade. I have not navigated through 3 levels of Syndicate sludge for you to zero out now." "Vex," Elias wheezed, his voice a dry rasp. You're leaking. Port 4 is drifting." "Port 4 is irrelevant," she snapped, though he could feel the tremor in her powerful arms. "The internal dampeners are fried, and the echo is screaming for a reunion I will not grant it. We are approaching a cold spot in Sector 11. The Syndicate's sensors are blind there. Just stay with me, Elias. Focus on the Purr." He tried, he really did. But the blood loss was making the geometry of his mind tilt. He found himself slipping back to the Mare Nubium colony, seeing the cracks in the silver dome he had designed. He saw the faces of the 200 colonists, the people he had valued less than a Syndicate budget. He had spent 5 years trying to be a ghost because ghosts didn't have to carry the weight of their failures. But as Vexara's warmth radiated through his cooling skin, he realized he couldn't be a ghost anymore. Not when a 7-foot-tall alien was risking a fate worse than death to keep him breathing. They reached the cold spot, a hollowed-out debris harvester that had been decommissioned 20 years ago. It was a cavern of rusted steel and frozen oil, smelling of ancient voyages and forgotten men. Vexara set him down with a gentleness that defied her predatory nature, propping him against a stack of discarded thermal couplings. "Assessment, Elias," she commanded, kneeling over him. Her bone-glass visor was gone, revealing the amber intensity of her eyes. Tears of luminescent fluid tracked through the soot on her cheeks. "Tell me how to fix you. My medical protocols are designed for Valen physiology. I do not know how to knit human meat." Elias looked down at his chest. The pulse bolt had cauterized most of the wound, but the internal shock had played havoc with his organs. "You can't fix this with a welder, Vex. I need a trauma stem, bottom of the kit, the red cylinder." Vexara's clawed fingers, usually meant for dismantling power armor, moved with agonizing precision through his battered toolkit. She found the cylinder, her eyes scanning the labels with a focused fury. The instructions say it overclocks the cardiac rhythm. It is dangerous for a fragile heart." "Better a fast heart than a still one," Elias managed a weak, lopsided grin. "Just jam it in. No point in playing it safe now, choom." She hesitated, her bioports flaring a nervous violet. "I have never felt fear like this, Elias. Not in the blood planes, not in the void. The echo provides a shield against the loss of a unit. But here, in the silence, your absence would be a void I cannot map." "That's called being a person, Vexara," he whispered. "It's messy. It's got terrible maintenance costs, but the view is better." She pressed the trauma stem into his thigh. The chemical surge hit Elias like a freight train, forcing his lungs to expand and his heart to hammer against his ribs with a violent, artificial rhythm. He gasped, his back arching against the cold metal. Vexara moved instantly, pulling him against her chest, her arms a reinforced cradle. "I've got you," she murmured, her throat beginning to vibrate. The purr was back, low, resonant, and grounding. "I've got you, fragile one." For an hour they sat in the hollow of the harvester, two splinters of broken systems clinging to each other. Elias's mind cleared as the stim stabilized his blood pressure, though the pain remained a dull, throbbing constant. He watched Vexara. She was staring at her hands, the silver bioluminescence of her ports reflecting in the oily puddles on the floor. "Why did you do it, Vex?" he asked quietly. "In the lab, you could have surrendered. You could have gone back to the echo. No more pain. No more static, just the forest." Vexara didn't look up. "The forest is beautiful, Elias, but it is a beauty without choice. In the echo, I knew every thought of my sisters, and they knew mine. We were a chord, but a chord cannot change its pitch. It cannot decide to be a different song." She finally met his eyes. "You gave me a slice of structurally unsound food and told me that efficiency was boring. You showed me that a singular note, even if it is out of tune, has more honor than a perfect symphony that is mandatory." "I think I'm a pretty bad influence," Elias muttered, leaning his head back. "The best," she agreed. "You taught me that my defect was actually my soul. And now the Syndicate and the Valen want to take that soul and turn it back into an asset. They want to turn you into a memory-scrubbed ghost." "Not happening," Elias said, his voice regaining some of its old architect's steel. "I'm done being a ghost, Vex. I spent 5 years hiding in the gut because I was afraid of the people I failed. But those people, they didn't die because of a defect. They died because I chose a system over a life. I chose the geometry of the Syndicate over the messy reality of being human." He reached out, his grease-stained hand covering hers. "I'm not making that choice again. If we're going to be splinters, then we're going to be the ones that jam the whole damn machine." Through the bioneural link, a sudden, sharp spike of coldness lanced through Elias's mind. It wasn't his pain. It was an external signal, a high-frequency pulse that made Vexara's eyes go wide with terror. She stood up in one fluid motion, her blades extending from her forearms with a metallic hiss. "They are here." "The specialists?" Elias asked, trying to scramble to his feet but falling back with a groan. "No," Vexara whispered, her armor clicking into an aggressive, spiked posture. "Something worse. The first blade has entered the station, Kalith. She is the mother of the 9th blade. The one who wove my neural filaments. The air in the debris harvester suddenly felt heavy, as if the gravity itself had become malevolent. From the darkness of the entry shaft, a figure emerged. It was taller than Vexera, its armor a bone white that seemed to radiate its own chilling light. It carried a spear made of living crystal that hummed with the collective voices of a million Valen. There was no dialogue. There was only the echo. Kalith didn't speak with her mouth. She projected a wall of psychic pressure that drove Elias to his knees. Shard 412. You have strayed from the cord. Return to the forest. The dross you cling to will be exterminated. Vexara stepped in front of Elias, her own blades glowing a defiant, angry orange. His name is Elias Thorne, and I am no longer a shard. Vex, wait, Elias shouted, his fingers flying across his data slate. She's not just a warrior, she's a mobile transmitter. She's slave to the station's primary relay. If you fight her, you're fighting the whole damn network. Then I will fight the network, Vexera roared, lunging forward. The collision was like a star collapsing. White light met violet shadow in a spray of sparks and tortured metal. Elias watched in horror as Vexara, still weakened from the white protocol, was thrown backward by the sheer psychic and physical force of the first blade. Kalith moved with a terrifying, inhuman efficiency. Every strike was calculated, every movement a part of a greater, hive-minded whole. She was the perfect system, personified, and she was dismantling Vexara with the clinical coldness of a butcher. Thorne, do something! Marcus's voice crackled on the comms, though it was buried under layers of Syndicate interference. The first blade is rerouting power from the core to her spear. She's gonna frag the whole deck just to get to you. Elias looked at his data slate, then at Vexara, who was struggling to stand as the bone-white spear descended toward her throat. He saw the scars on her neck, the ones he had touched, the ones that held the story of her defiance. He didn't look at the budget. He didn't look at the safety margins. He looked at the only person who had ever seen him as a bridge, instead of a failure. Hey, Kalith! Elias screamed, his voice echoing through the harvester. You want to talk about unity? Let's talk about a system crash. He didn't target the first blade. He targeted the one thing every Violin feared more than the void. He targeted the silence. Elias jammed his hydrospanner into the debris harvester's primary diagnostic port and uploaded a virus he had been writing in his head since the night they ate pizza. It was a recursive logic loop, a piece of code that demanded the system define the soul of a singular node. The gloom anchor didn't lurch this time. It screamed. The station's internal speakers, the intercoms, and the bioneural relays all exploded with the discordant, chaotic sound of a human heart. The irregular, beautiful rhythm of Elias's own pulse, amplified by the station's core. Kalith staggered, her white armor flickering as the echo link was flooded with a static of human emotion. The spear of crystal dimmed, its voices silenced by the sheer, messy volume of a singular man's defiance. Vexera didn't hesitate. She drove her blade into the first blade's chest plate, not to kill, but to sever the transmitter slave to her heart. The white light vanished. Kalith collapsed, her armor turning a dull, lifeless gray as she was disconnected from the hive. Silence returned to the harvester, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of the void. It was the silence of two people who had just broken the world to save each other. Vexara turned to Elias, her chest heaving, her amber eyes wide with wonder. You crashed the echo. I told you, Vex, Elias gasped, the trauma stim finally wearing off, leaving him cold and trembling. I'm an architect of systems, and I just decided that this station is under new management. Transformation is a painful process. It requires the breaking of old shapes to make room for the new. As Vexera knelt beside him, her purr returning in a deep, triumphant roar, Elias felt the weight of Marinubium finally start to lift. He wasn't a cornerstone. He wasn't a ghost. He was just a man, holding a spanner, choosing to be part of a family of two. But the Syndicate was still coming, and the gloom anchor was still rotating. We need to move, Elias, Vexera said, her voice full of a new, terrifyingly beautiful individuality. The hunt is not over, but for the first time, I know exactly where I am going. Where's that, Vex? Away from the forest, she whispered, kissing his forehead. And into the storm. The scream of the gloom anchor was a physical thing now. A grinding of tectonic plates as the station's core struggled to process the recursive emotional virus Elias had unleashed. Red emergency lighting bled across the walls of Sector 11, making the rusted debris harvester look like the belly of a dying beast. 20 minutes, Elias, Vexara rumbled, checking the tactical readouts on her forearm. Her voice was steady, but the violet bioluminescence on her skin was pulsing with a jagged, irregular frequency. The Syndicate has authorized a full station purge. They are venting oxygen from sectors 9 through 12. They would rather zero out their own workers than let a singular note escape the cord. Elias was back on his feet, though his left arm was slung tight against his chest, and his vision kept swimming in oily circles. He was leaning heavily against a diagnostic console, his fingers dancing across a holographic keyboard with a frantic, desperate grace. Standard Syndicate protocol, Elias grunted, his teeth gritted against the pain. If the asset is compromised, liquidate the environment. They're running a cost-benefit analysis on our lives, Vex, and right now, we're coming up as a net loss. They have forgotten one variable, Vexara said, her blades retracting into her gauntlets with a sharp clack. She stepped toward the heavy blast door that led to the primary hangar. They are calculating for 2 splinters. They are not calculating for an architect and a warrior who have rewritten the code. Through the bioneural link, Elias felt her resolve. It wasn't the cold, sterile discipline of the ninth blade anymore. It was something hotter, sharper, a protective fire that made his own blood feel like liquid nitrogen. He looked at her, seeing the way her oversized engineering hoodie was torn and stained with his blood. She looked like a nightmare, and she looked like home. "Marcus, you there?" Elias whispered into his comms. "Tell me you've got a back door to Hangar 3. "Thorne, you're still breathing? I owe Jax 5 credits." Marcus's voice crackled through a wall of static. "Listen, it's a total cluster frag up here. The specialists are crawling over everything. Vargon has locked the docking clamps from the primary spire. Nothing moves without his biometric thumbprint." "I don't need his thumb," Elias said, a dark smile touching his lips. "I've got his architecture. Marcus, I need you to trigger a thermal overload in the coolant vanes we fixed yesterday. Not a big one, just enough to create a pressure differential in the hangar's venting system. You want me to blow the pipes? Thorne, the tech debt on those lines is already insane. If I trip the sensors, the automated turrets will turn me into a colander." "Just do it, Choom. I'll slave the turret controls to my slate. Trust me. Copy that. God, I hope your grandfather's 5x5 stuff is real." Tripping the thermal gate in 3, 2, 1. The floor beneath them buckled. A muffled thoom echoed through the station's structure, followed by the high-pitched whistle of high-pressure steam. For a heartbeat, the station felt like it was going to tear itself apart. "Pressure differential established," Elias gasped, watching the telemetry on his slate. "Hangar 3 is experiencing a malfunction. The docking clamps are currently being fooled into thinking there's a whole breach. They're going to auto-release in 90 seconds. "Movement!" Vexara hissed, shoving Elias behind a pile of salvaged cargo containers. The blast door at the far end of the harvester didn't open. It was cut open. A circular blade of white phase energy carved through the 3-inch obsidian plating like it was parchment. 4 specialists stepped through, but they weren't like the ones Elias had fought in the habitat. Their armor was reinforced, bristling with seeker drones and energy shields. At their head was Kalith, the first blade. Her bone-white armor was scorched and cracked where Vexara had struck her, but she moved with a renewed, vengeful focus. She wasn't using the Spear of Crystal this time. She was carrying a Void Cutter, a weapon that looked like a tear in reality itself, dripping with hungry, black energy. Shard 412, the echo boomed in their minds, louder than the station's alarms. "You have poisoned the relay. You have introduced chaos into the geometry. For this, there is no recalibration, only erasure." Vexara stepped out from the shadows, her silver hair whipping around her face in the artificial gale from the ruptured vents. She stood tall, her 7-foot frame a monument of defiance. "I am Vexara," she roared, her voice drowning out the echo. "I am a singular note. I am a story being written, and I choose him." She lunged. The fight that followed was a masterclass in the cost of transformation. Vexara wasn't fighting with the synchronized grace of the hive. She was fighting with the messy, unpredictable fury of a person who had everything to lose. She took hits that would have killed a lesser warrior, her violet bioluminescence flaring and dimming as she traded her energy for speed. Elias wasn't idle. He was the ghost in the machine, his fingers blurring as he hacked the harvester's internal systems. Turrets slaved. Seeker drones. Meet your new best friend. The floor. He slammed a key on his slate. The automated defense turrets mounted in the harvester's ceiling spun around, their red sensor eyes locking onto the bone-white armor of the specialists. A hail of pulse fire filled the room. The specialists, caught between Vexara's blades and the station's own defenses, began to fall. One was torn apart by a turret burst. Another was decapitated by Vexara in a blur of orange light. But Kaleth was different. She was the mother of the ninth blade for a reason. She ignored the turrets, her void cutter carving through the pulses of energy as if they were nothing. She focused entirely on Vexara, her strikes heavy and relentless. "Vex, the clamps are releasing!" Elias shouted, his voice cracking. "We have 40 seconds to hit the shuttle!" Vexara was locked in a blade clash with Kaleth, the orange and white energies hissing as they ground together. "Go, Elias! I will hold the mother! I will pay the debt!" "No!" Elias roared, stumbling forward. "No more debts, Vex! No more systems! We're choice, remember? Choice means nobody gets left behind." He saw the void cutter descending toward Vexara's shoulder. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have armor. He had a hydrospanner. Elias Thorne, the man who had hidden from his mistakes for 5 years, dived into the clash. He didn't try to block the void cutter. He jammed the spanner into the power coupling on Kaleth's back, the same one he had studied on the tactical relay earlier. The feedback was instantaneous. A surge of raw, unshielded phase energy traveled up the spanner and into Elias's body. He felt his nerves screaming, his heart skipping beats as the Valen technology tried to integrate with his human biology. But it worked. Kaleth's armor stalled. The void cutter sputtered and died, its black energy dissipating into the air. Vexara didn't waste the opening. With a cry of pure, unfiltered individuality, she delivered a spinning kick that shattered Kaleth's visor and sent the first blade flying across the harvester, crashing into a pile of deactivated droids. Vexara caught Elias before he could hit the deck. He was smoking, his skin pale and his pupils flickering. You absolute fool," she whispered, her amber eyes swimming with starlight. "You are a meat sack. You are fragile. Why would you touch a void coupling?" "Because I'm a singular note, Vex." Elias managed a weak, blood-stained grin. "And I really hate bone-white armor. Doinam, we are moving now." She scooped him up, her powerful legs eating the distance to the hangar door. Behind them, Kaleth was struggling to rise, the bone-white light of her armor flickering like a dying candle. They burst into Hangar 3 just as the primary docking clamps shattered. The station groaned as a cargo shuttle, a battered gray brick of a ship named the Asteroid Queen, began to drift toward the void. "Marcus!" Elias shouted into his comms. "We're at the door. Give us a bridge." "Thorne, I can't stabilize the ship. The Syndicate has cut the gravity well. You're going to have to jump for it." The gap between the station's deck and the shuttle's ramp was 15 feet and growing. Below them was nothing but the cold, indifferent darkness of deep space. Vexara didn't hesitate. She tightened her grip on Elias, her bioports flaring to their absolute maximum. The violet light was so bright it was blinding. "Hold your breath, Architect," she whispered. "Vex, wait." She jumped. For a heartbeat, Elias felt the true weight of the void. It was cold, silent, and absolute. It was a place where systems didn't matter and budgets were meaningless. There was only the warmth of Vexara's arms and the steady rhythm of her heart. They hit the shuttle's ramp with a bone-jarring thud. Marcus was there, his dark skin slick with sweat, his hands yanking them inside as the airlock hissed shut. The Asteroid Queen's engines roared to life, fighting the gloom anchor's gravitational pull. Through the viewport, Elias watched the station recede, a massive obsidian needle floating in a bruised sky. He saw the red emergency lights flickering. He saw the vents spewing frozen oxygen. He saw the system he had built, and the system that had tried to break him, becoming smaller and smaller until it was just another star in a sea of millions. Elias lay on the floor of the shuttle, staring up at the flickering overhead lights. His body was a map of pain, his nerves were fried, and he was pretty sure he was going to need a new set of ribs. Vixera knelt beside him, her armor retracted, her silver hair falling across his face. She looked down at him, her amber eyes glowing with a peace he had never seen. "We are 5 by 5, Elias Thorne," she said softly. 5 by 5, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. He reached up, his fingers tracing the scars on her neck. Not as an engineer checking a port, but as a man touching the person he loved. "So," Elias said, his humor returning with a sharp, painful edge, "since the asteroid queen doesn't have a kitchen, I guess the pizza party is postponed?" Vexara let out a sound, a deep, resonant vibration that started in her chest and filled the entire shuttle. She was purring. "I think I can wait," she said, leaning her forehead against his. "We have an entire galaxy to learn how to be singular notes, and I have a very good teacher." Marcus stood at the helm, shaking his head. "I'm putting in for a transfer to a quiet moon. You two are a total nightmare for my blood pressure." "Shut it, Marcus," Elias laughed, then winced as his ribs protested. "And fly the ship. We're choice now. And choice. Choice means we go wherever the hell we want." The shuttle jumped into warp, leaving the gloom anchor behind. 2 splinters flying through the dark, finally whole. The hunt was not over, and the Syndicate would not forget. But as Elias Thorne drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, held safe in the arms of the deadliest alien in the galaxy, he knew one thing for certain. The view was definitely worth the price. The hum of the asteroid queen's warp drive was a far cry from the tortured, rhythmic groaning of the gloom anchor. Here in the belly of this battered cargo hauler, the sound was steady, almost musical, a sequence of vibrations that spoke of sanctuary rather than a tomb. Elias Thorne lay on a medical bunk that felt like it had been salvaged from a pre-expansion era destroyer. His body wrapped in layers of bioconductive gauze. The cooling gel inside the bandages hissed softly, knitting together the ragged edges of his skin, where the void coupling feedback had tried to turn his nervous system into a highway of ash. He was 34 years old, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't calculating the cost of the oxygen he was breathing. "Stay still, you reckless glitch," a voice commanded. Elias didn't need to open his eyes to know it was Marcus. He could smell the lingering scent of engine oil and the cheap synthetic tobacco the docker favored. He heard the clink of a medical scanner being set down on a metal tray. "I'm 5 by 5, Marcus," Elias rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged through a gravel pit. "Just checking the internal geometry." "5 by 5, my ass," Marcus snorted. He leaned over Elias, his dark face illuminated by the flickering green light of the ship's monitors. "You took enough phase energy to power a small moon, Thorne. Your heart stopped twice on the ramp. If it weren't for her, well, let's just say I was already looking for a nice way to tell the station's insurance department that you went out in a blaze of stupid." Elias forced his eyes open. The cabin was small, cramped, and filled with the chaotic clutter that defined a life on the rim. It was a beautiful sight. "Where is she?" Marcus jerked a thumb toward the cockpit door. "She's at the helm, or staring at the helm. It's hard to tell. She hasn't moved since we jumped. She's quiet, Elias. Dead quiet. The bioneural link you two share, it's doing something weird to the ship's sensors. The asteroid queen is purring like a kitten because of her." Elias tried to sit up, but a jagged spike of pain in his ribs forced him back down with a groan. "The first blade, Calith. Did we really drop her?" "You jammed a hydrospanner into a god-tier power coupling, Elias. You didn't just drop her, you short-circuited the local echo link," Marcus said, his expression softening into something resembling awe. "The data streams coming out of Gloom Anchor are a total disaster. The Syndicate is in full-blown panic mode. Vargon is probably still screaming in that escape pod you welded shut. But more importantly, the workers, the dregs, they saw what you did. They saw that a singular note could crash the choir." Elias looked at his hands encased in translucent medical gloves. "I didn't mean to start a revolution, Marcus. I just wanted to save a girl. That's how it usually starts, Choom, Marcus said, packing his medical kit. You spend your life following the code, checking the safety margins, and then one day the budget just doesn't matter anymore. I've spent 20 years on that station, bowing to every silk-suited executive who walked past. I had a pension coming. I had a quiet retirement planned in the Martian domes. And now you're a fugitive on a brick of a ship with 0 credits to your name, Elias noted. Regrets? Marcus stood up, his massive shoulders brushing against the low ceiling. He looked out the small viewport at the swirling, iridescent tunnel of warp space. I'm a docker who helped an architect and a ghost walker steal the Syndicate's most expensive asset. I'm zeroed on the station, but for the first time in 2 decades, I don't have to ask permission to piss. So no, Elias, no regrets. I chose my pack. And turns out, my pack is a couple of broken circuit lunatics. Elias managed a genuine smile. Secondary characters like Marcus were supposed to be the grounding wire, the ones who kept the dreamers from flying too close to the sun, but Marcus had chosen to fly with them. He had reinforced the theme Elias was only just beginning to process, that the systems we inherit, the jobs, the pensions, the hive minds, are just cages until we choose the people we're willing to break them for. The door to the cockpit hissed open, and Vexera stepped in. She looked different. The obsidian armor was gone, replaced by a simple, form-fitting flight suit that Marcus must have found in the lockers. Her silver hair was loose, falling in a shimmering cascade over her shoulders. The amber glow in her eyes was no longer a predatory fire. It was a warm, steady hearth. She moved to the bunk with that fluid, soundless grace that still made Elias's heart skip a beat. She didn't say anything at first, just looked down at him, her fingers tracing the air above his bandages. The fragile one wakes, she whispered. I heard you were scaring the ship's sensors, Vex, Elias joked, his voice gaining strength. Vexara sat on the edge of the bunk, the weight of her presence a comforting anchor. She reached out, her long, elegant fingers brushing against the side of his neck where the bioport used to be. The metallic ring was still there, but it was cold, its connection to the station severed. The echo is silent, she said, her voice full of a profound, dizzying wonder. For the first time since I was a hatchling, I cannot hear the voices of the sisters. There is no forest. There is only the now. Is it scary? Elias asked. It is absolute, she replied. It is a void, but a void I can fill with my own thoughts. I am no longer Shard 412. I am Vexara, and I remember the taste of the pizza. I remember the smell of the winter mint on my skin. I remember the way your heart beat when you jumped in front of the mother's blade. She leaned down, resting her forehead against his. Through the bioneural link, Elias felt a surge of emotion so pure it nearly made him weep. It wasn't the synchronized unity of the hive. It was the messy, singular, beautiful gratitude of a woman who had been given back her own life. You taught me the lesson, Elias, she murmured. Efficiency is death. Perfection is a lie. But choosing to be broken together, that is the only geometry that matters. We're a pair of splinters, Vex, Elias whispered, but at least we're our own splinters. Marcus cleared his throat from the corner, looking uncharacteristically awkward. Hate to break up the moment, lovebirds, but we're coming out of warp in 10 minutes. We're heading for Ethelgard. It's a moon on the edge of the neutral zone. No Syndicate, no Valen High Command, just a lot of red rocks and people who don't ask questions. Ethelgard, Elias repeated the name, tasting it. Sounds like a fixer-upper. The whole galaxy is a fixer-upper, Thorne, Marcus laughed. But you're the guy with the hydro spanner. I figured you'd like the challenge. Vexara stood up, her hand lingering on Elias's shoulder. I will prepare the landing sequence. The mother taught me how to break worlds, but I think I would like to learn how to build one. As she walked back to the cockpit, her throat began to vibrate. The purr was so loud it made the deck plates hum in sympathy. It was a sound of contentment that defied her history, a sound that proved she was no longer a weapon. Elias lay back, watching her go. He started processing the weight of what they had done. He had spent his 34 years running from the ghosts of 200 dead colonists at Mare Nubium. He had told himself that his defect was his soul, but in reality, his defect had been his fear. He had been afraid to care about a system's components more than the system itself. But as the asteroid queen shuddered, preparing to transition back into real space, Elias felt the last of that fear dissolve. He hadn't just saved Vexara, he had saved the version of himself that was capable of love. He had realized that humanity wasn't about the domes we build or the star stations we maintain. It was about the choice to stand in the gap when the dome cracks. Coming out in 3, 2, 1, Marcus shouted. The stars snapped back into focus, thousands of pinpricks of light in a velvet sky. Below them, the moon of Ethelgard loomed, a vast, rust-colored marble hanging in the void. It looked harsh. It looked lonely. It looked perfect. The immediate aftermath of their escape was a blur of tactical adjustments and survival protocols. But as Elias looked out the viewport at their new home, he knew the climax of their journey wasn't the battle they had won. It was the life they were about to start. The ninth blade was broken, the architect was retired, and for the first time in 5 years, the signal was 5 by 5. The moon of Ethelgard was a world of eternal twilight and jagged obsidian mountains that mirrored the skyline of the Gloom Anchor, but without the oppressive weight of Syndicate control. Here the air tasted of cold minerals and ancient dust, and the sky was a deep, bruised violet, crowded with the shimmering rings of the gas giant that loomed overhead. 7 months had passed since the asteroid queen had touched down on the Red Plains. Elias Thorne sat on the porch of a small, prefabricated dwelling he had spent the last half-year modifying. In his lap sat the same battered gray toolkit that had survived the docking bays of Sector 9. He was currently elbow-deep in the internal workings of a localized atmosphere generator, the very same model he had been repairing in the first chapter of his exile, though this one was missing half its casing and was held together by sheer willpower and recycled copper. He wasn't fixing it because a supervisor had ordered him to. He was fixing it because his neighbor, an elderly Talarian refugee with 4 children, needed the heat for the coming winter cycle. "You're over-torquing the primary coil again, Elias," a voice rumbled from the shadows of the doorway. Elias didn't look up, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm not over-torquing it, Vex. I'm giving it character. It needs to know who's boss." Vexara stepped out into the violet light. She was dressed in heavy, rust-colored work clothes, her silver hair braided back in a practical knot. The bioports along her arms were no longer metallic. She had used a bioresonance frequency to encourage her skin to grow over the sockets, leaving only faint, silvery scars that looked like constellations against her gray-blue skin. She looked less like an apocalypse and more like a woman who had finally found the floor beneath her feet. "The Talarian says you are a miracle worker," Vexara said, leaning against a support pillar. She reached out, her long fingers plucking a microdriver from his kit and handing it to him before he could even reach for it. "I told him you were just an architect who liked to swear at pipes." "Same thing on this moon, Choom," Elias grunted, slotting the driver into the coil. "In the Syndicate, I was an asset. Here, I'm just the guy who keeps the lights on. It's a lot more work, but the pay is better." "We have no credits," Vexara noted, her amber eyes sparkling with amusement. "Exactly. People pay in stories and home-brewed ale. Much better exchange rate." Through their connection, Elias felt a wave of peace radiate from her. The Echo Link was a distant memory now, a static-filled ghost that occasionally flickered in her dreams, but it no longer had a hold on her. She was a singular note, and she had spent the last 7 months learning how to sing her own song. Marcus appeared at the edge of the clearing, hauling a crate of salvaged solar panels. He had grown a thick, bushy beard and looked 10 years younger than he had on the station. "Hey, Thorne, the expansion on the water recyclers is done. Jax and the boys from the colony are asking if you're coming down for the solstice celebration." "I'll be there, Marcus," Elias called back. "Just let me finish debugging this radiator. I promised the kids they wouldn't have to sleep in their coats tonight." Marcus gave a sharp whistle and a thumbs up. 5 by 5, architect. Don't be late. Vexara's homebrew is actually starting to taste like something a human can drink without losing their stomach lining." Vexara laughed, a sound that was no longer a grind of gears, but a genuine melodic chime. "It is an acquired taste, Marcus, much like your human humor." Elias watched Marcus walk away, his heart feeling a strange, heavy warmth. This was the transformation he had never expected. He had spent his entire life building systems that were designed to be perfect. only to realize that perfection was the enemy of connection. At Mare Nubium, he had built a dome for 5,000 people, but he hadn't known a single one of their names. Here, on a moon that barely had a breathable atmosphere, he knew the name of every soul in the colony. He knew their fears, their failures, and the way they liked their coffee. He had traded a career for a family. He had traded a system for a pack. Elias set down his tools and stood up, his 35-year-old body feeling strong and vital. He looked at Vexara, who was watching the sunset paint the obsidian mountains in shades of golden fire. "You're brooding," she said, her eyes shifting to his. "Just reflecting, Vex," he replied. He stepped toward her, his hand finding hers. Her skin was warm, the texture familiar and grounding. "Thinking about how many times I tried to run away from being a person because I thought it was more efficient to be a ghost." Vexara pulled him closer, her head resting against his shoulder. Her purr started, a deep, resonant vibration that echoed through his chest, a sound of absolute contentment. "I am glad you stopped running, Elias Thorne," she whispered. "The view from here is much better than the one in the forest." "Yeah," Elias breathed, looking up at the gas giant and the thousands of stars that didn't look like targets anymore. "It really is. I spent most of my 35 years believing that the universe was a series of equations that needed to be balanced. I thought that if I built the dome strong enough and kept the budgets tight enough, I could engineer a world where pain was obsolete and failure was just a bug in the code. I treated people like variables, and I treated myself like a machine. When Mare Nubium cracked, I didn't see the lives lost. I saw the error in my geometry. I fled to the gloom anchor because I wanted to be a ghost in a place where nothing mattered but the maintenance logs. But then I crashed into a 7-foot-tall apocalypse with amber eyes, and my entire architecture came crumbling down. Vexara didn't need an architect to fix her bioports. She needed a human to tell her that her singular note was worth more than the Syndicate's symphony. In saving her, I realized that I was the one who was truly malfunctioning. I learned that family isn't something you're born into or a designation assigned by a hive mind. It's a choice you make every single morning. It's the decision to stay when the system tells you to run. It's the willingness to be broken, to be out of tune, and to be structurally unsound if it means you get to hold the hand of the person you love. Humanity isn't a baseline or a biological category. It's the courage to be a singular, imperfect note in a universe that wants you to be silent. I'm not a cornerstone anymore. I'm just a man with a hydro spanner and a pack of 2 lunatics. And for the first time in my life, I know exactly what I was built for. I was built to choose. I spent half a decade hiding in the dark because I was terrified that my failures defined me more than my potential. I thought that if I stopped caring, the world would stop hurting. But I wonder, is there a system in your own life, a job, an expectation, or a memory that you've been treating like a cage? What would happen if you stopped trying to be the perfect component and finally gave yourself permission to be a singular, messy note? Elias picked up his toolkit and tucked it under his arm, his fingers brushing against the worn metal of his lucky hydrospanner. He looked at the girl who had been designed to be his death and realized she had become his life. "Come on, Vex," he said, turning toward the doorway. "Let's go see if that home brew is actually drinkable. I feel like celebrating being human tonight." She followed him inside, her purr filling the quiet twilight of Ethelgard, a sound that carried across the red plains like a promise that some broken things are meant to stay that way.